All right, good afternoon, Earth Ethics folks. This is a session for session number 17 on environmental policy, governments, corporations, and non-governmental organizations and NGOs. I'm also going to talk some about institutions here. I'm very sorry I can't be with you live today. I have another conflict, but pre-recording this here and hope it'll be helpful for you. We can discuss it further when we have class here. I'm going to use the share screen function now to open up a PowerPoint and work my way through this here. And then I've also got several clips of some video clips that I want to share with you to give some examples and insights along as we go along the way here. Now, one of the basic insights on this here is that environmental ethics doesn't have only to do with individuals or even communities, but also has to do with the broader range of environmental policy. And some of the influential stakeholders on environmental policy obviously include governments, but corporations are very influential, and then nonprofits here. So we wanted to explore some of the relationship of this and what insights environmental ethics might be able to give us to start thinking about some of these issues here. So I'm going to start with an opening claim that Traer makes in his chapter on this here. He says, effective public action requires clarifying the ethical presumptions of environmental policy and implementing these presumptions. So one of the things that is clear about this here is that environmental policy rests on particular environmental ethical presumptions or ethical claims that belie them there that have then resulted in formulating policies. So this is that relationship between policies and ethics. Presumably good policies are founded on good ethics, and that's why ethical analysis can be so helpful in terms of formulating good policy. Traer goes on to say, not only governments at all levels, but also corporations and non-governmental organizations or NGOs are involved in formulating and implementing environmental policies. And so we want to take a look at this relationship and see what contributions, if any, environmental ethics can help to formulating better policies in this area here. So I'm going to start with a couple different levels of government, which is what Traer does in his chapter there. And the first one is international law. Now, one of the things to be aware of is that environmental law is a relatively recent field. We're really talking about the last 30 or 40 years. And so legal traditions, particularly in the West, that go back to English common law, or maybe go back to Roman law, different Western traditions on that here, have almost been exclusively human-centered. And it's only been in the last 30 or 40 years that the field of environmental law has been emerging, and trying to embed this both at the international level through treaties and agreements, and also at the government level here. So some of the things that Traer says are presumptions about influencing environmental or international law. He says that governments and citizens have a duty to support public actions that will, one, realize the right to environmentally sustainable development. Again, here's a rights argument here, and an argument that all people have a right to environmentally sustainable development. So again, this is a human-centered and anthropocentric argument, as we're going to see most of these are here. But this parallels the Montana Constitution's right to a clean and healthy environment, but at the international level. Secondly, protect the right for every person to a healthy environment. Again, a rights argument. As I mentioned, this is a right that is reflected in the Montana Constitution, one of very few state constitutions in the United States that have this embedded in the Constitution. The US Constitution does not have this embedded there. And so at the federal level, this is only passed through laws that can be reformed or changed. In Montana, we have a constitutional right for every person to have a clean and healthy environment. Thirdly, to maintain the integrity of the environment for future generations here. This is, again, can be analyzed in terms of both character and relationships reasoning here, that we have a responsibility to live in such a way that we maintain the integrity of the environment for future generations. Now, most times people in international law see this as future generations of human beings, but we can also think of future generations of other animals who will need wildlife habitat that's protected for that. And there's the relationships reasoning we see so much in the ethics of care as well. And fourthly, then, developed countries have a duty to assist developing countries to mitigate carbon emissions and adapt to adverse consequences of climate change. This is an equity and justice issue, and it's based on the premise that we talked about in class before, that the primary responsibility for causing the climate change problem has been with developed nations or wealthy nations, particularly the United States, which has by far the largest share of carbon that's in the atmosphere from our development here. And so since wealthy nations or large carbon producing nations have benefited tremendously from the industrialization that has led to these greenhouse gas emissions, we have a responsibility now for mitigating the problem and helping others to address that solution here. So these are premises in international law looking at environmental issues. And you can notice that all of these, again, are primarily anthropocentric. These are human rights-based arguments here. We also see in the United States, and of course, this is a complex area, so we can just summarize it fairly briefly here. But the United States has also tried to embed some of these environmental presumptions in our laws here. And one of the ways that we do that is the National Environmental Policy Act. Another one is NEPA, where all federal agencies must consider the environmental impact of their activities. This is a very powerful law because it means that any activity that goes on public lands, or especially federal public lands, must consider the environmental impact of those activities ahead of time and solicit public opinion on that for there. So there are several premises that are reflected in this commitment in NEPA. One is to fulfill the responsibilities of each generation as a trustee of the environment for future generations. And again, this can be framed in several different ways. One of these is, again, a character issue there, that we need to act responsibly or embed our actions responsibly so that we leave a healthy environment for future generations. Some people have argued for the notion of anticipatory rights and making a rights argument here, saying that even though future generations don't exist now, we can anticipate that they will exist, and therefore they have a right to inherit a healthy environment, so known as anticipatory rights in that sense. Secondly, NEPA is to try to assure for all Americans safe, healthful, productive, and aesthetically and culturally pleasing surroundings. So this is a responsibility argument that the government has a responsibility to make sure that actions that take place on public lands do not impair Americans' right to these outcomes here. Third, to attain the widest range of beneficial uses of the environment without degradation, risk to health or safety, or to other negative consequences. Now, much of federal management operates under multiple outcomes management there. And there's so that we manage public lands for multiple different uses. Those can include for natural resources such as timber and mining. Those can include recreation. They're set aside for people to use recreation. Those can include environmental protection of watersheds, a variety of different uses on that here. And NEPA is put in place to make sure that this wide use of a range of beneficial uses of the environment do not cause degradation, risk to health or safety, or other negative consequences. And to do that, then, you have to study the issue ahead of time there. There's also a responsibility to preserve important historic, cultural, and natural aspects of our environment here. So notice again the blend of both human and we could say biocentric or ecocentric concerns here in preserving these different aspects of the environment. And then this effort to achieve a balance between population and resource use that permits a high standard of living and a wide sharing of life's amenities. So there's a recognition that public lands exist, at least in part, to meet the needs of the US population. And resource use is really an important part of that here. Almost all of us have various different ways we use this, whether it's the wood in our homes or the mining, the minerals that we use, different things there. But we need to change a balance between the resource use that permits that high standard of living and wide sharing of life's amenities with also environmental protection there. And then to enhance the quality of renewable resources and approach the maximum attainable recycling of depletable resources. So this recognizes that there are at least two categories of natural resources. One of those that we consider to be natural or renewable resources. These would be things like forests or populations of fish that can renew themselves there. And then there are also depletable resources where there are limited numbers of things, such as minerals. And so part of the concern here is to reach a maximum attainable recycling of depletable resources so we don't simply deplete them all and future generations are without them here. Now, the way that the NEPA does this, the National Environmental Policy Act, is primarily, one, federal agencies must consider the environmental impact of their activities. And if this impact is likely to be significant, then they have to prepare what's known as an EIS, an environmental impact statement, that considers various different alternatives that could be done, including a no action alternative. Now, this is oftentimes based on a CBA and a cost-benefit analysis there. Again, consequentialist thinking, trying to understand what the impact or what the consequences of these various different actions would be ahead of time, and then to weigh the balance of those. But NEPA also requires participation. It is supposed to be a transparent process that gives important place and space for public participation and input. And as you remember, this is one of the key norms of the ethic of ecological justice, the participation, particularly by those who are going to be most widely affected by outcomes of actions or decisions, is critically important. And NEPA embeds that in law so that there is always a commentary period where the public has the right to weigh in on proposed actions by the federal government, and the government has to respond to that input there. So that's one realm of the government here, just sort of thinking broadly about how environmental ethics can shape and influence government in formulation of policy. A second area is the whole realm of corporations, and recognizing that corporations increasingly have significant impact on our environment, and they exist in a different realm than governments do, sometimes subject to government regulations, but oftentimes with multinational or transnational corporations, they are larger than any one single national state. So there has been a lot of push towards corporate responsibility or building sustainable practices within corporations here. And Trera discusses some of these that are happening in the chapter we read for today. A big tension on these is whether these actions should be voluntary versus mandatory. There are several things that the government makes mandatory, such as through the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act. But there's also a large movement for corporations to take these responsibilities on voluntarily as part of their corporate responsibility in that area there. And we'll take an example of some case studies there that Trera talks about in the book there. And again, I notice that the sustainable practices or corporate responsibility is largely going to impact on consequentialist arguments, the efficiency of the actions, the cost savings, and what kind of actual impacts do they have to the environment. So it's not that other forms of environmental reasoning, whether those are rights and duties or whether those are character and care arguments, are not important. But for the most part, consequentialist arguments are going to be key in weighing the advisability of these practices here. So I want to start with a case study here. And this is one that is covered in the book there by a company known as Interface Floor. That's a carpeting one, and Ray Anderson is the CEO. I'm going to stop share here and pause this for just a moment so I can get the video there. I'd like you to hear from him directly, and then also see an interesting video that shows the effects of this company's work on that. So this is a YouTube video here, and let me see if I can get it started here and play for you.
I think I'm also very, very proud that the business case for sustainability has emerged very clearly. We know at Interface our costs are down, not up. So that dispels a myth and exposes a false choice between the environment and the economy. Not so. You can do both and. Our products, but through the inspiration of biomimicry and the wellspring of innovation that has come out of the idea of sustainable design, the lens of sustainable design has made our products better than ever. And then, as I've said so many times, the goodwill of the marketplace is astonishing. There is no amount of slick advertising at any cost that we could have done that would have created the goodwill that this effort has created. You're talking about authenticity at its very, very best. This is a better way to make a bigger profit. And a more legitimate one at that. And it's coming not at the expense of future generations and not at the expense of the earth. Ultimately, there's no doubt that at some point I have to slow down. someday. I have to be thinking ahead to that day when I can no longer do this. But in the meantime, we have this thing called RAISE that is the consulting arm of the company that we created to respond when other companies ask us, how you do this. And a wonderful anecdote around that. One of Jim Hartsfeld, who runs RAISE, one of his first clients was a big multinational food company that sent 15 people to LaGrange, Georgia, top management people, one woman in the group, and she was head of global engineering. This woman did not want to be there. She did not understand why they would come to a carpet mill in Georgia, of all places, of all things, to learn about sustainability. What could they possibly learn from us? So she didn't want to be there, and she's skeptical about the whole thing. So the first half of the morning that they're together, she's obstructive and challenging everything. And then the mid-morning break comes, and to get to the ladies' room, she has to actually go through the factory. They're in this conference room out in the factory. So on her way to the ladies' room or back, I don't know where she encounters James Wisner, fork truck driver, on the factory floor with this big roll of carpet on his fork truck. And she stops him. And she says, "What do you do here?" Sort of in that tone of voice. And James, bless his heart, said, "Ma'am, I come to work every day to help save the earth." And she was just stunned by that. So she started drawing him out. What do you mean? Da, 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 da. And finally, after a couple of minutes of it, he said, "Ma'am, I don't want to be rude, but if I don't get this roll of carpet to that machine in the next minute, our waste and emissions are going out of control. I've got to go." She came back to that meeting, a visibly different person. She sat there very quietly, in total contrast the way she had been before. And then after a while, she started challenging her people. "Why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we doing that?" And then she told the story of her encounter on the factory floor. And she said, "I've never seen anything like it," to demonstrate the alignment in the company from the very top of an organization clear to the factory floor. She says, "There's only one word I can think of that describes it, and it is love." Love on the factory floor. As we re-examine the progress we've made in retrospect, looking back, you can see things that you didn't see so clearly looking forward, before the fact. But one of the things that's really clear is that you unleash the creativity of an organization when you hold up a vision that is so outrageous that it takes the breath away. When people are gasping, "What did he say?" And when the vision is that ambitious, it's taken us places we never would have dreamed of. We've just begun. But remember the Chinese proverb, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step." I'll see you along the way, and we'll do this together because it's the right thing to do.
So that's one example about one person here, Ray Anderson, and it's really interesting to see the influence that one individual can make in there. You'll see in the next video here, Ray Anderson read a book by Paul Hawkins called Ecological Economics, and that so convinced him that he needed to change the very nature of his multinational corporation that he went through that transformation. We're going to see that in the next video clip here that looks at how to build a circular economy. You may have heard Ray Anderson mention biomimicry. And biomimicry is this field that's emerging now that says nature for 3.8 billion years has been designing as a way of life so that the waste products of one organism become the food or the input for other organisms, so that you have a circle or an ecological way of doing things. But our business model has typically not reflected that. And so it has used what we sometimes call the heat, beat, and treat model. Heat meaning it takes enormous amounts of energy to produce things. Beat means you put them under lots of high pressure to get them in the shape there. And then the treat is using lots of toxic chemicals. And that has created both a lot of negative byproducts, but it's also made products very difficult to recycle once they're done. The circular business model there is trying to mimic biomimicry, mimic ecosystems here. And so that's what we're going to see in the next video here. And let me see if I can pause my sum here and I'll get that ready to go. So this is a case study now just using a circular business model. And again, you'll see it uses interface floor, the model for that.
When I sailed around the world, I took with me a minimum of resources. What I had was all I had, and I managed those resources down to the last drop of diesel and the last pack of biscuits. This is a typical Thames waste barge on its way to landfill. Once we dock, the rubbish around me will join mountains of waste materials of every kind. We have to aim to stop products getting here. We need to close the loop. Modern industry as it currently operates is not sustainable.
Using cheap fossil fuels and resources, the economy produces mostly waste. It is take, make, and dispose. Using less and becoming more efficient sounds a good idea, but it only buys time. It doesn't close the loop.
This isn't a recycling issue because recycling doesn't work for all materials. Most products, when they're remade, need the addition of new raw materials, which means we're still taking, and slowing the process isn't a long-term solution.
In future, we can take our cues from living systems. Here, waste equals food. It runs on renewables and celebrates diversity. We could design with a circular economy in mind, where products are made to be made again, and everything is a nutrient for the biosphere or for industry. There will be no such thing as waste.
There's no reason that industry can't follow this model, using materials that can re-enter the cycle, be remade into new high-quality products, or biodegrade to feed the next process. Then we'll be making items that really are made to be made again and again and again. This is Interface Floor. They've made remarkable progress towards a closed-loop system, whilst also increasing profitability. So where did the journey to sustainability begin for Interface Floor?
It began in 1995 when Ray Anderson, our chief exec and founder, read a book by Paul Hawkins. That book affected Ray so deeply, he came and challenged all the senior execs in the company to make the business sustainable.
Yeah.
We've been reshaping our processes, our thinking, the whole business to try and achieve that by 2020.
Interface Floor are industry leaders because of their dedication to innovation. Meet Cool Green, developed and designed by Interface Floor to reclaim materials from used carpets, which are put straight back into the new ones.
So this carpet tile has just fallen down. What's going to happen to that?
When we make carpet tiles, we make it from bitumen and we end up with waste product. We used to produce about 700 tonnes of this material a year.
What does it end up being like when it comes out of the other end of this?
It's a 3-stage process. It goes through what we call a rotary guillotine to get it into the form that we can start mixing it and agglomerating it into one homogeneous pellet. That is still too coarse for us to use,
Yeah.
so we will then what we call pulverise it.
That's like flour.
It is a little bit like flour, yes. That's then mixed into our bitumen compound to make carpet tile.
So that becomes this the second time round.
Yes.
You can do that forever effectively.
Yeah.
So you've eliminated the waste entirely.
We've closed that loop entirely. Yes.
Yeah. Pretty amazing.
From the cool green machine, the powder that it produced goes through the bitumen kitchen, which mixes it with bitumen and limestone. And then the carpet's laminated onto it.
And what percentage of limestone is in the material in the bitumen?
We've got about 70% of recycled limestone, and that's a waste product from the road building industry. It's no good to them, so we can reuse that. Okay, so once the carpet's cooled down, it's cut into squares, it's inspected, and then it's collated.
So that's it.
And that's a carpet tile, yes.
Stamped out.
That's stamped 50 centimetres by 50 centimetres, yes.
And what's different about this? Because it's not all moving at the same time.
It's called an intelligent conveyor. It only conveys when the actual tiles need to be transported, and it saves about 60% of the energy of a normal conveyor.
That's pretty impressive, isn't it? Right, I better get this one back off.
Interface Floor can also rent you a carpet. They'll repair and maintain it, and at the end of its life, they'll reprocess it. This cuts waste even more, increases profit, and turns floor covering into a service.
I think Interface's carpet is not just based on some recycled content, which is what's commonly held as being sustainable these days. It's the whole ethos behind the business and the company. The fact that we've been using green tariff electricity, for example, since 1998, the degree of training and knowledge used by our engineers, by our designers to actually try and build sustainability in right from the design back to taking the carpet back and eventually recycling it.
So Lindsay, you've set a target of 100% sustainable by 2020. What on earth will that look like?
What that will look like is that face and our carpet tiles are made with 100% either recycled or renewable based yarn. The backing is made from recycled carpet tiles.
Yeah.
And all the processes are driven by renewable energy.
So that really will be 100% sustainable.
That's what they intend.
That's an incredible challenge, isn't it?
Certainly,
Very
it's
exciting,
only
man.
10 years away.
Yeah. You're going to be busy, I think.
We're going to be very busy.
Okay, so those are a couple examples of some examples of corporate responsibility, and Trayer gives several other examples in the book, and I encourage you to look. You can check online. There's lots of different YouTube videos, things like that. There's some really very impressive things being done at the corporate level that are trying to help us think about this here. The third actor that Trayer talks about in this chapter is the non-governmental or NGOs here. And this is one that we're probably more familiar with here for the advocacy and the action. But again, the question we're trying to look at here is how do environmental ethics, how do environmental values influence both the mission and the actions of these very, very many different results here. And in fact, let me just pull over quickly here. A book by Paul Hawkins that some of you may know. And I should have paused this before, but let me stop the screen share here for just a second and I'll hold this up. This is a relatively a book that Paul Hawkins wrote a few years ago called Blessed Unrest, How the Largest Movement in the World Came into Being and Why No One Saw It. And if you're ever feeling discouraged about what's happening in the world there, this is a wonderful book to read because he documents tens of thousands of people's movements, nonprofit NGOs and so forth, all over the world who are doing incredible work here, oftentimes below the radar screen of what we see in the mainstream media, but very, very effective work. And you can see it in our own community, everything from Climate Smart Missoula to the Clark Fork Coalition to Watershed Education Network, just thousands and thousands and thousands of citizens who've joined together in nonprofit groups here to try to carry out this work here. And so I'm going to just go through a couple examples here that Trayer highlights in the book. First one is Greenpeace International. Now, Greenpeace is a fascinating organization because it began by protesting the nuclear testing of nuclear weapons in the Pacific Ocean that was destroying whole atolls and releasing nuclear contamination in there in the 60s and 70s. In the process, and they did that by literally putting themselves on the line. They would take their small boats and put them in the areas where the nuclear bombs were supposed to be detonated to try to prevent them from doing that direct action on that there. And they have 5 core values. One is bearing witness, to actually just try to point out and bear witness to what's happening so we see what's happening there. They're committed to nonviolence, very much like the civil rights movement there. They're independent of corporate sponsorship and so forth. They believe in no permanent friends or foes. And so that is somebody who's an adversary today may well be an advocate or an ally tomorrow. And the goal is to make them that. And then how to promote solutions. One of the things that is so interesting about Greenpeace International is the way they've morphed to study different issues from their original concern about nuclear weapons. And one thing that happened during that time is they were spending all this time in boats out there, and they became much more intimately familiar with the life in the oceans, particularly whales. And so they evolved into an anti-whaling organization as well. But now they're involved in many, many different things, particularly climate change here. And I wanted to have us take a quick look at 3 short videos here. One is just the Greenpeace 2020 video that just sort of highlights shortly what they've been focusing on this past year here. And then they have a series of different videos that talk about different themes here. And there's many different ones we could look at. I chose 2 of them here. One is called Stewardship of Nature, and the other one is on climate change. Just to give us a little bit of sense again about how nonprofit groups or NGOs are using their ethical values to work in this area here. So let me pause the recording and I'll pull up the video. So here's the first one here, and this is just the Greenpeace 2020 end of year video. So this is a short piece on stewarding nature. It comes out of Greenpeace.
When I think of how to organize the stewardship of nature, I think of all the ways we must reimagine our global food system. The world has over 50,000 edible plants, but just 3 of them, rice, maize, and wheat, provide 60% of global caloric diet. We also use a growing percentage of the world's arable land to produce crops for biofuel or cheap animal feed. This is no coincidence. It was economic design, and it limits our potential for a thriving, biodiverse planet. EU subsidies distort the global market. They are also higher for environmentally friendly agricultural practices. So while countries like Germany dump surplus wheat on the international market, stifling the production of local alternatives, the EU essentially greenwashes itself while allowing monoculture crops to be imported for animal feed, contributing to the destruction of vital ecosystems like the Amazon. Reforming the EU's common agricultural policy is currently up for debate, but without understanding how it perpetuates global inequalities, it will continue to disadvantage trade partners and avoid the international collaboration we need for a more equitable food system. Feeding the world while also regenerating land and increasing biodiversity is possible, but it will require global collaboration rather than economic competition. It involves agricultural practices now known as agroecology and permaculture design. Techniques many indigenous civilizations have practiced since before colonialism attempted to strip them of such knowledge. We must remember that forests and other food-producing ecosystems tend to thrive more when communally managed, rather than under any other conservation method. And barring local indigenous communities from the land that they feed themselves from is never the answer. Agricultural land should be seen as a global common, while also supporting local food producers and regional sovereignty. EU policies need to be reevaluated to ensure they don't suppress local production in other countries on the one hand, while simultaneously attempting to boost it through international aid on the other. What would our world look like if countries with the most natural resources were the wealthiest? What if regulations ensure that the majority of a product's value, including added value from processing, stayed in the country of origin? These shifts in global food production will certainly change what is available in Western markets. Are you ready to give up on some of the comforts that capitalism and global extractivism provide you? Our diets and consumption patterns will need to shift, and we will need to support one another along the way. As we approach the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement, let's make it an opportunity to come out of the current global economic and health crisis with a renewed commitment to global environmental and social sustainability. If this year has taught us anything, it's the importance of health, safety, and resilient communities. Strengthening our global food system is one major step to ensuring those things are possible.
So that's one vision, in that you can see really how Greenpeace is working as a nonprofit organization there, but they're working with government institutions and also with corporations there, the 3 of them trying to recraft or rethink policies, in this case, food policies, for how they affect much of the environment and poor people. This next one is a conversation that's more specifically focused on climate change. This has, of course, become the framing issue of our time, of many things here. And we'll give you a little sense about how Greenpeace is a conversation they're having with this on climate change as well. So let me start this video here.
It still hurts to look at how much we have lost in a few hundred years. So many relatives that are no longer here. We all know how we got here was written on the wall. There were pictures of white men with too much power to destroy all across the hall. But you wonder, how did we get out of these harmful ways? How did we rebuild our dignity, community, and restore our landscapes? Looking for answers, I had to ask some hard questions like, does my own work help my neighbors, the soil, my street, society? If not, isn't it good to stop production and rebirth our work ethics? After all, it is what we do every day that normalizes our relationship to everyone and everything. So contrary to what was instilled in us through fairy tales of adventure, conquest, and action, the change didn't start with production, but with retraction. And since our livelihoods and ability to live attuned to ecological realities had been eroded, and wage economy had us laboring to climb ladders to nowhere, it took quite some organization, solidarity, and legislation and push for implementation to gain the basic universal income as a basis for transformation. Freeing up capacity to meet the challenge, climate care workers in all shapes repairing balance. See, on a broken planet, there is one permanent job opening. We needed healers of all sorts to guide us through processes of restoring. This essential work, this care work, is taking place in gardens, in creating free public transport, energy, architecture, schools, and hospitals. We finally humbled ourselves to all become cleaners and to stop trashing places and other people. We defunded the police, and care institutions stepped in to address the need for safe streets. And in tech universities, abuelitas taught us traditional ecological knowledge that was thought to be extinct. We shed skins with the Red Deal, bringing change from below and to the left. With rights from Mother Earth, indigenous-led governance was needed to reorient our concept of working for good, not for better, because restorative balance required us to let go of reaching for the top and instead reach for enough. But there is still work to do before we can brag about what we have achieved. Politics and business of mass destruction is still feeding off crises. While bosses make billions, employees get fired or need 2 or 3 jobs. The fight is fierce, but as we dismantle toxic systems and build back with dignity, together we make history.
So that gives you some sense of Greenpeace as one organization here. And again, Traer profiles several different groups here. Another one that I think is very familiar to many people, the World Wildlife Fund, the Sierra Club here. The Sierra Club has been a really interesting one here. It began and John Muir and many people on the West Coast. As you can see there, the mission to explore, enjoy, and protect the wild place of the earth is in the kind of place, particularly the Sierra Nevada. But it's expanded its mission quite a bit here now to practice and promote the responsible use of the Earth's ecosystems and resources, to educate and enlist humanity to protect and restore the quality of the natural and human environment, and to use all lawful means to carry out these objectives there. Sierra Club has had a really interesting time of reckoning here with the emergence of the Black Lives Movement and much greater sensitivity to the racist histories and white supremacy in here, having to come to terms with some of the founders, including John Muir, and their involvement in white supremacy at their own time and the roots of the conservation movement in white supremacy. And so trying to come to terms with that, issuing apologies for that, and much more fully integrating environmental justice in their work there. Another case study that Traer outlines a little bit is the World Wildlife Fund here. You can see their evolving logos on the bottom there. They've used the panda bear as a classic example of a sort of classic megafauna, charismatic megafauna to draw attention there. But the mission of the World Wildlife Fund is to protect and restore species and their habitats, explicitly biocentric and ecocentric. But now increasingly to strengthen local communities' ability to conserve the natural resources they depend on here. This has come awareness that the John Muir model of conservation by walling people out of wild places, such we've done in national parks and wildernesses, it severely disadvantages local peoples and oftentimes works against the very conservation now. And so you can see that beyond their original mission of protecting and restoring species and habitats, there are now much more sensitivity to the interacting with local communities and looking at market and policies. So the second step there, strengthen local communities' ability to conserve the natural resources they depend on. Awareness that oftentimes community managed lands are much, much more sustainable when the local communities are involved in that. And secondly, to transform markets and policies to reduce the impact of the production and consumption of commodities, particularly when these are animal-based commodities that threaten the very livelihoods and viability of the species there. And then the goal to mobilize hundreds of millions of people to support conservation. So what began very much as a biocentric, ecocentric perspective has now incorporated more human perspectives there to interact with and work with local communities and other communities to continue that work. So out of this whole thing has come a notion of collaborative strategies, and collaboration is simply one tool in the toolkit. There are many other ones that we could be looking at here, such as a legal work and advocacy work here. But Traer highlights collaborative strategies as one that's increasingly trying to draw on these three major sectors to work together: the business sector, the nonprofit sector, and the government sector here. So I wanted to just do one little case study here of a group called BICEP, the Business for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy, to give you one example of a group that now is trying to build on the synergies of these there as a collaborative way of approaching together. So here's a short video clip that just discusses a little bit this Business for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy work.
There are many companies right now articulating why we don't need to act on global warming. The BICEP companies, on the other hand, are articulating why acting now is smart, it's good for the environment, it's good for national security, and in their minds, good for the economy.
BICEP is the Business for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy, and it's a coalition of companies that have come together because we believe that the United States needs a clean energy economy. And the group is really working together to try and influence the legislation moving forward.
The expectation today is that responsible companies will take action on climate change, and the responsible companies will actually do their part to reduce the footprint around the world. And we believe that BICEP is a way to give those business communities who are already doing that a voice on Capitol Hill, so that our legislators, our policy officials, and our elected officials can understand that the business community is not against progressive and active climate legislation.
But for any company, trying to work on a state-by-state basis is impossible. We really need national legislation, and we need it to help us incentivize and get to that next level of innovation.
The legislation that BICEP is pushing for is the most progressive that we've seen come out of the business community. To see 80% reductions below 1990 levels by 2050, 25% by 2020. That's impressive to see that the business community at that level, large national and international companies are pushing for that to level the playing field.
We launched BICEP last November with 5 founding members, including Levi Strauss, Nike, Starbucks, Sun Microsystems, and Timberland. And since then, we've added eBay, Gap, Symantec, and other consumer companies. The stars here today are the business leaders who are not only interested in the rule of law, transparency, and a science-based policy, but they're interested in acting and acting now on comprehensive climate policy.
It's a priority for anyone who's involved in a global economy, whether we're talking about one store down the street here in DC or we're talking about our global supply chain. It's hugely important that we stress the urgency of climate issues.
For us as a coffee company who rely on this product that's grown in very specific regions and very specific microclimates around the world, we've already seen evidence that climate change is impacting our ability to procure coffee from these coffee farmers.
And the cost of doing this is going to continue to go up every year we wait. So it's very important that we get started now.
We need that government commitment to work on energy efficiency, and that's why BICEP has included it as one of our primary principles. And above all, we believe that scientifically based targets and a significant price on carbon will unleash the kind of innovation that we need to lead us towards a low carbon economy and good green jobs and a prosperous future.
When the time comes to vote, they won't have the business community to hide behind, because we are going to be up there on Capitol Hill talking to them and saying, look, we need to address this now so that we have some stability as businesses, so we can forecast our financials, so we can forecast our supply chain.
The ultimate goal, right, the end goal for everybody is that we have an international agreement on climate change. And we need something to replace Kyoto post-2012. And we are not going to get movement on climate change in the international arena unless the US comes to the table with a really clear set of policies.
So that just gives a little taste of some of the different things on here and collaborative strategies. Now, one of the things, of course, and I'll talk about in the next section here, is how do we monitor this? We're very familiar with lots of efforts, what people call greenwashing, that businesses have glitzy and high advertising here, that ExxonMobil will sponsor oil or Earth Day, things like that. So how do we actually monitor that these business strategies are doing what they claim to be doing? And we'll talk about that in the coming section here. But first, I wanted to just do a very brief thing about, go over what Traer uses in terms of the ethical analysis that's behind these different institutions here, government, nonprofit groups, and businesses. As we mentioned before, the duties and rights arguments that come up in international law, they are foundational, but most ethical arguments for international law and business are anthropocentric. They're explicitly anthropocentric, and that's the right to a healthy and sustainable environment. That differs a little bit from some of the nonprofits that are highlighted in the chapter there, who also have a strong biocentric and ecocentric concern, such as the World Wildlife Fund or the Sierra Club or Greenpeace. But sometimes those are also framed in anthropocentric terms in order to be able to get into the policy debate, or they are simply integrating a broader range there for success in their movement on that here. In terms of character and relationships, several of these different ones, we see some examples here. Ray Anderson and Interface Floor, I think, is a really interesting example there, where he read this book by Paul Hawken on ecological commerce, and was really convicted by it in terms of what he was himself was contributing to, which was the destruction of the earth there. And so he changed his entire company now to reflect a different set of values, this commitment to corporate responsibility and sustainability on that here. And you see this in the NGOs we look at too, this commitment to many different character values. If you go back and look at Greenpeace, for example, these the virtues of integrity, nonviolence, respectful conduct, and environmental activism. There are lots of different virtues on there, but trying to carry out their mission while also reflecting the character of the organization, the character of the kind of communities they want to be part of and create on that here. A strong commitment on all these folks to best science as being really critical part of how they evaluate the consequences there. And then what I would also put in here is many of these NGOs reflect in what Traer calls a delight in nature, what E.O. Wilson calls biophilia, this that we have a natural inclination to love of all of life, as motivation for both our character and our relationships, where we expand our moral community beyond the human community and our character virtues to relate to other parts of the natural world and reflect an ecological culture on that. But then again, a key factor when you're working at level of institutions is consequences. Traer talks about this, how do we test our values and commitments? And he says all governments, corporations, and NGOs use consequentialist reasoning to measure and evaluate their environmental commitments. They all have mission statements that state their values and principles, but then they need to find ways to test those and see whether they're actually being effective here. And as I mentioned before, a very important one now is the issue of accountability. Increasingly, both corporations and nonprofits are using third-party organizations to evaluate the results to ensure a more objective assessment here. So there's one protection against the greenwashing there. To actually get, there are now increasingly third parties that are neutral in that sense, that have well-established criteria that will evaluate the consequences there and see how well they line up with what the companies or organizations are saying about their intents and their values are. So that's kind of a summary of what Treyer is doing in there. I wanted to also then bring up some insights from a chapter from Marion Hortican's book on environmental ethics. Marion Hortican is an EVST alum. She teaches at Colorado College. And this is a wonderful book that I've sometimes used in this class as well. She has one chapter that I think is very helpful called Ethics, Institutions, and the Environment there. And I want to go over just a few of these things here. She starts by noticing that there are three common critiques of environmental ethics that people have made here, and that she takes seriously and tries to answer. One of them is that she says traditionally environmental ethics has been too focused on the non-human realm. And in fact, many people have seen it as misanthropic or anti-human, that if we simply got rid of humans, we would resolve environmental problems. And there certainly has been a strong sense of that in the early part of the movement. I think you still see it in some parts of the movement today. There, particularly with concerns about climate change. But it's also being overcome with movements like the environmental justice movement, which explicitly focuses on the effects of human communities of this area here. Some people have argued that environmental ethics is just too theoretical. We spend all our time arguing about deontological versus virtue ethics versus consequences ethics, and it just needs to be more pragmatic. It needs to focus on how we can actually influence policy and build consensus against communities. And Marion is sympathetic to that here, but doesn't want to go too far. She says one response is environmental ethics is not only about policy, but also how we should understand, value, and act in the world. It makes a difference who we see as part of our moral community. It makes a difference about what kinds of values we have towards others there. And those then should be reflected in our policies there. And so thinking thoughtfully about environmental ethics is really important on that. She goes on to say, sometimes disputes about value do matter. She gives an example of debates about ecosystem services. Quote, framing our understanding of nature and its value through the lens of services is in tension with the idea that we should treat plants, animals, and ecological systems as having value independent of the benefits they provide to human beings. Ecosystem services has been framed as a way to try to put a monetary value or commodity value on the services that nature provides that human beings need, such as clean air, healthy soil, clean water, and so forth. But what that does is it puts them in terms of the instrumental value, the value they have for humans there, whereas many people have a strong moral intuition that we should treat plants, animals, and ecosystems as having intrinsic value independent of any benefits they provide for us here. And so these debates about value become really important when we start to think about how to implement these in policy. And then there's another critique of environmental ethics, and I think this is one we sometimes fall into nature in our environmental studies program, that it can inculcate despair. We can focus so much on the problems that we don't spend enough time focusing on the solutions. We need more positive reinforcement and look at what are we doing well as examples of that here. And some of the examples I've tried to show today, I think are showing examples where people are making and organizations are making a positive difference on this here. So in her look at ethics as involved in institutions and infrastructure here, she defines an institution as a significant practice, relationship, or organization in a society or culture. And we sort of take them for granted. They can be governmental institutions such as a police force or a taxing bureau there, or a health and education organization. They can be a non-governmental organization. They can be business organizations there, but when they have an institutional value there. And she says the key point we need to aware is that from birth, we're embedded in institutions. In fact, we're all right now embedded at the University of Montana as an institution. And institutions are full of norms. They're laden with values that we can oftentimes recognize through their practices. She gives us one example how our institution of education has just changed at the school level there. She says, in terms of getting to school, virtually everyone used to walk. I remember this as my grade school here. The bus service was only available to people who lived more than a mile and a half away from the school, and virtually everybody lived within that distance there, so everybody walked or they rode their bikes. Today, less than 13% of school children walk to school. And this is because of institutional changes, things like school choice, where you can now go to a school, it doesn't have to be in your neighborhood here, or patterns that factor driving. So walking is no longer the social norm when it comes to getting to school. And this has unintended consequences, negative impacts both on the children. We see rising obesity and social isolation, and in communities here. And so one example about how an institutional pattern can reshape the very way we interact with the natural world and have lots of negative consequences on that. And so there's a lot of attention being paid to what people call the hidden curriculum. What are the values and norms that are being implicitly taught by institutional practices there, how practices are carried out there on there, how much attention we pay on convenience, or practices are based on fear of neighbors there. And so one of the things that if we were doing this class live here, I would be asking us to look at the University of Montana and say, what is the hidden curriculum that we're learning here in terms of, for example, food on campus, or energy use on campus, or transportation use on campus, a variety of different things here that is not only the explicit curriculum that you're learning in your classes, but the hidden curriculum that is shaping the University of Montana as an institution. And perhaps we can do some more discussion of that here. So Marion goes on to say that changing these patterns of living requires not only a shift in values, but consideration of the ways institutions and infrastructure can be redesigned to support alternatives. Let me give you one example here. We're really fortunate in Missoula that we have a free bus system. That was not the case when I first moved here. One of the first changes that happened with the bus system here was they made it free to University of Montana students who had a GRIS card. And so that meant that people who lived off campus and didn't necessarily want a bike, or the weather's not good, didn't have to drive here. And we've got alternatives there for education here. Another pattern here, and I know this is frustrating for people sometimes here, but is limiting the number of parking spaces on campus here. So it makes it inconvenient to drive to campus, which can be an inconvenience, but it also reshapes our transportation patterns in favor of biking, walking, public transportation kinds of things. So these are the kinds of institutional patterns that shape our ethics a lot as well. And so Marion goes from the values, institutions, and infrastructure, so moving from analysis to a reimagination of ways we can start to think about that here. And a common theme point here is institutions and infrastructure not only reflect our values, but they also shape them. And here she quotes one of my favorite things from Albert Borgman. He's a retired philosophy professor here. He has what he calls the Churchill principle. That is, we shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us. And this is an awareness of the kind of the physical infrastructure can shape the interactions we have here. It comes quite simply from the fact in World War II, the English parliamentary building was bombed during the war there and largely destroyed. And so England had to decide how to reshape that here. If any of you have ever watched a parliamentary debate in England, in London, it's really fascinating. The parliamentary building is built on the style of an old choir loft in a cathedral, where you have two different sides facing each other. And in the cathedral, you'll be singing to each other. In this place, they're debating each other. And so you are always looking directly across the way at the opposing side and facing them. We have a different model in this company. We have an amphitheater model there, which is very much the same shape as for example, the Gallagher building, GB 123, where we're having our class there. And what that does is that focuses everybody's attention to one person at the front, and everybody else is sitting kind of an amphitheater and can't speak to each other very much here. Because of COVID, normally I would be teaching our Earth Ethics class, probably in the Honors College, where we would all be sitting around a circle or a rectangle, and we'd all be seeing each other, and that would shape our discussion. Because of COVID, we've had to reshape that here. And I think you can see the effects of that when we're sitting in an amphitheater style classroom, socially distanced there, very important for our health concerns. But you've noticed how much more difficult it is for us to have interactive discussion. That's a shape that works well for somebody who's just lecturing. And if you just want to lecture and somebody's taking notes, it works well. But if we want collaborative, interactive discussion there, we need different shaped buildings. And that's what Albert Borgman is trying to pay attention to, that we need to pay attention to how we shape our buildings, because once we have that physical infrastructure in place, they shape us. Let me give you one other example that I love about the University of Montana. I love the fact that our campus is built around a large open space called the Oval. And what the Oval does is it centers our campus in ways that foster interaction. So when the weather gets nice, people are out on the Oval. They're throwing frisbees, they're reading their textbooks. Right now, we've got the skating going on out there, but it's a shared common space that then helps reflect and build community at the university here. So a key insight that Marian Hordican wants us to think about is that institutions and infrastructure not only influence a single decision or even daily habits, like whether or not we commute to work by car, they also channel our imaginations. They narrow the range of possibilities for change or expand the possibilities for change. And so we want to ask, how does the contemporary world shape and constrain our imaginations and our sense of possibility? And the way we build our communities, the way we build our institutions there very much will shape that as we think about that here. Let me give you one other example here. And again, it's kind of a small one here, but when I was growing up, it was very rare for a lot of kids to have their own bedroom. Almost all of us shared our bedrooms with siblings. And there may have been one TV in the room, and it was in the family room. And so the effect of that here is, and again, I grew up from a large family, is that you grew up learning how to share space with others. You had other people in your bedroom, and there was one TV, and you all had to agree what you were going to watch on, and we all sat down and had meals together there. Increasingly, we reshaped our houses so that most individuals have their own room. Within that room, they can have their own television or their own computer or their own cell phone there. And so we've reshaped the interaction, our patterns there by just the layout that we have in terms of access to devices and things. And that shapes the kind of community that we have here. So one conclusion that Marian Hordican makes is, as we come to inhabit increasingly human-shaped and human-centered worlds, the relationships between nature or humans and nature are being weakened and severed there. And Blood example here, Love's book on Last Child in the Woods, he talks about nature deficit disorder, that increasingly children are spending almost all of their time in human-shaped environments there and have very little time in the natural world here. And then increasingly, we are come to be spending our time in human-shaped and human-centered worlds, and that has a lot of impact on our ethics and how we understand and relate to the natural world here. One result then is that as the human-dominated world colonizes our imaginations, that's what we live in, it may become increasingly difficult to appreciate and value the other than human, or even to notice it. Increasingly, the built environment inhibits our ability to imagine and implement an environmentally responsible world. Now, that's one of the things I think we're really fortunate about here in Montana, is that we still have pretty easy access to a world outside of there. You can bike to the Rattlesnake Wilderness area here. There's a lot of recreational outdoor activity, and University of Montana attracts a lot of students who are drawn to the outdoors. So we're really fortunate here that we have a lot of access outside the built environment there. But increasingly, that's not true in other parts of the world, and that is having an effect on how we can even imagine what our world would look like here. There's also what Hordican calls environmental generational amnesia, that each generation adapts to an increasingly degraded environment, yet accepts it as the non-degraded baseline. We all know only what we started with here, and then we accept that as the baseline and then go from there on that. Now, I had an interesting experience of this here when Bryce Andrews came and spoke to another one of my classes this last week, and he talked about what he called the carnivore gap that shaped the 20th century. That by the early 20th century, large predators such as wolves and mountain lions and bears had largely been eliminated from most of the lower 48 states there. And so we had several generations who grow up in this country here whose experience of nature was devoid of predators. And that's what they understood as what nature is like. Then at the end of the 20th century, when we started to reintroduce predators such as wolves, it has created a lot of cultural conflict because people their experience of nature was being changed and challenged on that here. And so the importance of design here, and Marian Hordican again wants to emphasize the good news. The good news then is that context, institutions, and infrastructure can not only constrain, but also open up new possibilities and new ways of thinking. I think a wonderful example of that on our campus here is the Payne Family Native American Center. If any of you spend any time there, you walk into that building and you're immediately in a circular space that draws your attention upward there, and it reshapes the kind of interactions that go on in that building here. And so we can be paying attention to how we shape our context institutions there in terms of what facilitates the kind of interactions that we want to have on here. Now, the big issue then becomes of scaling up these issues here. And I wanted to end our discussion today with one example. This has been the worldwide movement towards divestment within fossil fuels, largely led by young people on there, but a very, very important one here. We're actually going to have a case study. Case number 6 is going to ask us to think about this here. But I wanted to just stop with 2 short video clips here that give some sense about how we can think about these issues here. So let me pause for a moment here and I'll get those ready to go. So this is just a short clip called "What is Fossil Fuel Divestment?" And I suspect many of you are already very familiar with this here. We have had a very active movement on the University of Montana campus called Reinvest Montana, trying to get the university to divest from fossil fuels and reinvest that money into sustainable energy here. But this is just a short clip that we'll take a look at here.
Have no future. Today, in oil, gas, and coal reserves around the world, there is 5 times more burnable fuel than will ever be safe to burn. Yet, despite undeniable proof that they're fueling a climate crisis, the fossil fuel industry is ploughing on with its mission to find more. These companies, with all their financial might, are the biggest obstacle to climate progress. They have our political process in shackles with their lobbying power, their arm bending of politicians, and their spreading of false information. And they are enjoying billions in government subsidies every year. Fossil fuel companies only care about one thing: money, and their ability to keep making it. What can we do about this? And who can stand up against them and steer the world towards a safe future powered by clean, renewable energy? Well, you can. You and me and her and them and those guys and that group over there and their friends and them. They might have power and money, but we have a different currency. It's us, our movement, and we can hit them where it hurts. Since 2012, thousands of respected institutions, local governments, and individuals have pledged to divest from fossil fuels. It's the fastest growing divestment movement in history. Divestment is deliberately moving your money away from companies you're not happy with. It's helped to stop some of history's worst offenders, including apartheid South Africa. Each act of divestment takes back power from the fossil fuel industry and helps create a mandate for our leaders to take real climate action. We'll be asking people and institutions everywhere to divest from this self-serving industry of the past. Clean, just, renewable energy technologies will ensure a safe future, and they're ready and waiting for our investment.
So let me end with one other little video clip here that I find really interesting and inspirational here. Many of you are familiar with Greta Thunberg, and here's an example of the power that one person can make in really setting up, in this case, a worldwide movement towards divestment. She's now invited to virtually every international conference that deals with climate change, speaks to those different areas there. I was very fortunate to have the experience of being at the UN Climate Change Conference in Katowice, Poland 2 years ago. And that was just when Greta Thunberg was coming on to the first scene, and had a chance to see her there. But this is her speech recently at the World Economic Forum in Davos there. And I think that is a good example of speaking truth to power, and again, about how a people's movement can really scale up and make a huge difference here. So let me go ahead and get this started.
We are going to start with some words from Greta Thunberg, who made headlines around the world last year by saying here at Davos that our house is on fire. I am so honored to welcome her to the stage.
1 year ago, I came to Davos and told you that our house is on fire. I said I wanted you to panic. I've been warned that telling people to panic about the climate crisis is a very dangerous thing to do. But don't worry, it's fine. Trust me, I've done this before, and I can assure you it doesn't lead to anything. And for the record, when we children tell you to panic, we're not telling you to go on like before. We're not telling you to rely on technologies that don't even exist today at scale and that science says perhaps never will. We are not telling you to keep talking about reaching net zero emissions or carbon neutrality by cheating and fiddling around with numbers. We're not telling you to offset your emissions by just paying someone else to plant trees in places like Africa, while at the same time forests like the Amazon are being slaughtered at an infinitely higher rate. Planting trees is good, of course, but it's nowhere near enough of what is needed, and it cannot replace real mitigation and rewilding nature. And let's be clear, we don't need a low carbon economy. We don't need to lower emissions. Our emissions have to stop if we are to have a chance to stay below the 1.5 degree target. And until we have the technologies that at scale can put our emissions to minus, then we must forget about net zero. We need real zero. Because distant net zero emission targets will mean absolutely nothing if we just continue to ignore the carbon dioxide budget that applies for today, not distant future dates. If high emissions continue like now, even for a few years, that remaining budget will soon be completely used up. The fact that the USA is leaving the Paris Accord seemed to outrage and worry everyone, and it should. But the fact that we are all about to fail the commitments you signed up for in the Paris Agreement doesn't seem to bother the people in power even the least. Any plan or policy of yours that doesn't include radical emission cuts at the source starting today is completely insufficient for meeting the 1.5 or well below 2 degree commitments of the Paris Agreement. And again, this is not about right or left. We couldn't care less about your party politics. From a sustainability perspective, the right, the left, as well as the center have all failed. No political ideology or economic structure has been able to tackle the climate and environmental emergency and create a cohesive and sustainable world. Because that world, in case you haven't noticed, is currently on fire. You say children shouldn't worry. You say, just leave this to us. We will fix this. We promise we won't let you down. Don't be so pessimistic. And then, nothing. Silence. Or something worse than silence. Empty words and promises which give the impression that sufficient action is being taken. All the solutions are obviously not available within today's societies, nor do we have the time to wait for new technological solutions to become available to start drastically reducing our emissions. So of course, the transition isn't going to be easy. It will be hard, and unless we start facing this now, together with all cards on the table, we won't be able to solve this in time. In the days running up to the 50th anniversary of the World Economic Forum, I joined a group of climate activists demanding that you, the world's most powerful and influential business and political leaders, begin to take the action needed. We demand at this year's World Economic Forum, participants from all companies, banks, institutions, and governments immediately halt all investments in fossil fuel exploration and extraction, immediately end all fossil fuel subsidies, and immediately and completely divest from fossil fuels. We don't want these things done by 2050, 2030, or even 2021. We want this done now. It may seem like we are asking for a lot, and you will, of course, say that we are naive. But this is just the very minimum amount of effort that is needed to start the rapid sustainable transition. So either you do this, or you're going to have to explain to your children why you are giving up on the 1.5 degree target. Giving up without even trying. Well, I'm here to tell you that unlike you, my generation will not give up without a fight. The facts are clear, but they are still too uncomfortable for you to address. You just leave it because you think it's too depressing and people will give up. But people will not give up. You are the ones who are giving up. Last week, I met with Polish coal miners who lost their jobs because their mine was closed. And even they had not given up. On the contrary, they seem to understand the fact that we need to change more than you do. I wonder, what will you tell your children was the reason to fail and leave them facing a climate chaos that you knowingly brought upon them? That it seemed so bad for the economy that we decided to resign the idea of securing future living conditions without even trying? Our house is still on fire. Your inaction is fueling the flames by the hour. And we are telling you to act as if you loved your children above all else. Thank you.
So let me end on just a positive little note here. I really like this short little clip here with Greta Thunberg and George Monbiot about protect, restore, and fund, this positive way that we can respond to this here, which we'll be picking up some of those different notes in. So let me do one more share screen, and then we'll close it up for today.
This is not a drill. My name is Greta Thunberg. We are living in the beginning of a mass extinction. Our climate is breaking down. Children like me are giving up their education to protest. But we can still fix this. You can still fix this. To survive, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. But this alone will not be enough. Lots of solutions are talked about, but what about a solution that is right in front of us? I'll let my friend George explain.
There is a magic machine that sucks carbon out of the air, costs very little, and builds itself. It's called a tree. A tree is an example of a natural climate solution. Mangroves, peat bogs, jungles, marshes, seabeds, kelp forests, swamps, coral reefs, they take carbon out of the air and lock it away. Nature is a tool we can use to repair our broken climate. These natural climate solutions could make a massive difference.
Pretty cool, right?
But only if we also leave fossil fuels in the ground.
Here's the crazy part. Right now, we are ignoring them. We spend 1,000 times more on global fossil fuel subsidies than on natural-based solutions.
Natural climate solutions get just 2% of all the money used on tackling climate breakdown.
This is your money. It is your taxes and your savings.
Even more crazy, right now where we need nature the most, we're destroying it faster than ever.
Up to 200 species are going extinct every single day.
Much of the Arctic ice is gone. Most of our wild animals have gone. Much of our soil has gone.
So what should we do?
What should you do?
It's simple. We need to protect, restore, and fund. Protect. Tropical forests are being cut down at the rate of 30 football pitches a minute.
Where nature is doing something vital, we must protect it.
Restore. Much of our planet has been damaged.
But nature can regenerate, and we can help ecosystems bounce back.
Fund.
We need to stop funding things that destroy nature and pay for things that help it.
It is that simple. Protect, restore, fund.
This can happen everywhere. Many people have already begun using natural climate solutions. We need to do it on a massive scale.
You can be part of this.
Vote for people who defend nature.
Share this video. Talk about this.
All around the world, there are amazing movements fighting for nature. Join them.
Everything counts. What you do counts.
Okay, I think that's probably more than enough for today. I thank you for your patience in watching this here, and I look forward to being back with you live next week. We'll be doing our third case study next week called Hotspot, Public Responsibility and Environmental Racism. We'll look at the proposed storage of nuclear fuel on the Skull Valley Ghost Shoot Reservation in Utah. In the meantime, I hope you have a good rest of your day and a good weekend. And I'll look very much forward to seeing you in class next week. Take care, everybody.